Thank you for that warm welcome. I want to commend each of you for being here. This is not a difficult subject, as we experienced last evening, but it is a critical and important one in the life of the church. And so it's an honor for me to be here and to share in this event with you. And I'd like to commend our four sponsors for being willing to have the courage to address this and say this is something we as a church need to deal with. I think we have a unique opportunity as the church right now. In the Me Too age, our society is desperate for something of relevance on this issue of sexual abuse. We're not immune to it in the church, but I do think it is something that we as a church can give leadership to at this point in time. So just very important agenda here today. The stories you're going to hear from me today, and that's mostly what you will hear, are rooted in my personal experience with this issue over the last 20 plus years, and the learnings that have arisen for me out of those experiences. So let's begin. On the worship table, in the center of our small group, sat a shattered mug. The broken pieces were spread out across the tablecloth with their sharp, jagged edges painfully evident. Members of the Mennonite Church Eastern Canada credentialing body, of which I was chairperson, were trying to bring closure to a year-long experience, multi-year experience, in fact, of an investigation into serious allegations of ministerial misconduct that ended in the termination of the credentials of the pastor in question. As chair of that credentialing body, I'd entered this process near its conclusion, but keenly aware that our denominational staff person for the last year or more had probably spent, if not full-time energy, almost full-time hours on this particular case. And now, at the end of its cleanup stages, she was still devoting almost a quarter of her time to this issue. If the cup is a symbol of one's life, this was the cup we had been handed. As we stared at the broken pieces of the mug, we lamented to God the brokenness of this experience. We brought to God the pain that had been inflicted upon the victims and the numerous peoples whose lives have been impacted by significant failure. We confessed the pain and strain that we had experienced as staff, governing board, and committees. The broken mug was a stark reminder that we could never put those pieces back together again. We realized that the cup of our life and the cup of many lives would never be the same. We poured out our laments to God and asked for God's mercy and healing for the victims, for us, and for the perpetrator. At the end of our worship, amidst the shattered pieces, we introduced a new unbroken mug as a symbol of our hope for healing, fully knowing that for some the healing journey would be long and hard and that parts of their lives would never be the same. Each of us walked away from that worship time clutching a new mug filled with hopes and prayers that somehow God's spirit of healing would be at work. We left with a simple yet profound hope that when we journey with God, brokenness and pain always hold within them the promise of resurrection and the seeds of new life. Well, that experience began my journey with professional misconduct. That incident 20 plus years ago was not the first, and it will not be the last, perhaps in my tenure, but certainly not in the church. Over the past 14 years in my role as executive minister for MCEC, I have periodically been confronted by new instances of ministerial sexual misconduct. I've learned the hard way what it means for the church to confront these challenging issues. I'm deeply pained by what I have heard and witnessed, and yet, friends, I am profoundly hopeful. This image of the shattered and whole mug is still an important symbol for me with the encounter with sexual misconduct. We simply cannot deny the deep pain and brokenness that misconduct inflicts on its victims. At the same time, I've also witnessed the emergence of healing and hope and new paths when people enter with integrity, with courage, and with compassion. So what have I learned on this subject of professional misconduct, especially as it relates to clergy? First off, let me begin with a disclaimer. Don't believe everything that I say. For a couple of reasons. Ryan knows me too well. Firstly, the stories that I share with you are all true, except for one, and they are all untrue. They are rooted in my experience, but altered enough that I trust you will not be able to place them. Over my 20 years, I've been engaged with about 12 cases of alleged sexual misconduct. So any connections you make, I hope they are mistaken. My intention is not to put anyone on display, victim, family, or perpetrator. Changing the culture around sexual abuse in the church. I believe, friends, that the most important thing that we can do is to begin to change the culture in the church around sexual abuse and to move in the direction of becoming a survivor-affirming church. And when I use the term church, I mean everything. I mean congregation, I mean school, I mean camp, I mean regional church, national church body. Together, we are church. And I believe that there is a fundamental attitude shift that needs to take place if we want to move in the direction of becoming a victim and survivor-affirming church. Sandra left a message for me to call her because she knew I was involved with an investigation of clergy sexual misconduct, one that she was concerned about and had her doubts about. When I returned her call that afternoon, she recounted how she had workplace experience. She had some professional experience doing investigations around misconduct. She asked me at one point, "Do you have any DNA evidence?" I'm presuming you don't. That really makes it hard in cases like this to determine guilt, doesn't it? Firstly, changing the culture around sexual abuse means victims need to know that they will be treated with respect, dignity, and due process. If the church is going to abide by Sandra's expectation that we have the definitive DNA evidence in order to assess the truthfulness of a complaint, friends, we may as well just quit and go home. Nothing is going to change in the church or in the culture around it. We are the church. We're not a court of law. Our evaluations of a complainant's experience can be treated, I think, with more dignity than what we've experienced in the courts. We do need to treat them with integrity, both complainant and perpetrator. But if victims are going to have the courage to disclose their burden of pain, it's imperative that we have church experienced as safe space. They need to know that the church is not an adversarial court of law, but a community dedicated to truth and justice. Victims need to be convinced that the church is a place that will likely believe them more than disbelieve them. That we will take seriously their disturbing accounts of abuse. Young or old, our people need to have the confidence that they will be listened to with compassion and care, that their story, that they will be treated with respect and dignity. As Carol suggested last night, my bias is also that when a complainant comes forward, it is more likely that we can assume that what they tell us is true. And I would encourage us to hold those disclosures with care and respect and to treat them as truthful until it is proven otherwise. At the same time, we must also ensure that our listening and evaluation protocols include robust safeguards to ensure that truthfulness, due process, and natural justice are respected, not only for the complainant, but also for the accused. Don made it clear to his friends at church that he was confident that he knew who this confidential complainant was. We were in the same youth group as she was, remember? You all know what she was like. Misconduct. Fat chance. My bet is that she seduced the music director. Now look who's getting the blame. I don't buy it. He's an evil, despicable person who doesn't deserve to be called a human being. I'll never forgive that man for what he did to me. He tricked me into believing he loved me, and now look how he's ruined my life. I hate that man with a passion. I pray every day that a bus or something will hit him. I hope he burns in hell. As a school counselor, Ruth was used to hearing angry tirades, but this livid young woman was particularly vicious. As Ruth listened to the angry words of the young adult who blurted out her painful allegation of abuse, she thought to herself, this is a really angry, volatile young woman. I wonder if her version of this story is true. And I have to admit, I've always thought she dresses a little too provocatively. Secondly, changing the culture around sexual abuse in the church means we have to resist the knee-jerk reaction of blaming the victim. Dawn's accusation that the complainant had a history of promiscuity and Ruth's reservations about a provocatively dressed, angry young woman are typical of the strategies that we use to minimize the complainant and ignore the truth of their experience. Stop and think for a moment. Do strong, angry emotions discount a painful story? Or are we just uncomfortable with anger? On the other hand, what kind of emotions do we expect from a person who's been abused? And does a person's past sexual behavior automatically discount the truth of this particular incident? Even if the person was provocatively dressed, even if their behavior was inviting or flirtatious, in terms of the professional, does it really matter? When it comes to professional misconduct, it is always the responsibility of the professional or the person in power to set the boundaries and maintain them. Period. No further qualifications added. Let me illustrate. And this is the one story where I've not changed any details because I can't even place it myself. It's related to me by a friend of mine from another denomination who shared a story about one of her pastoral colleagues. Pastor was in his office alone in the church, no secretary, no one else present, and a parishioner walked in wearing a fur coat and high heels. The woman said to him, "I have a gift for you." She opened her fur coat to reveal her naked body. Stunned, the pastor immediately stood up and said to the woman, "I can't accept that gift." Walked out of his office, left the church, and left her standing there. Fortunately for him, He had the presence of mind and likely the appropriate boundaries training that allowed him to do the right thing. For him to have responded otherwise would have been professional misconduct. As extreme as this story may be, if the ending had been different, the woman would have been a victim of ministerial sexual misconduct. Stop and think for a moment. Who knows what pain, what betrayal, what mental health issue might have prompted this woman's desperate plea for approval? For the pastor to have taken advantage of her pain would have been an act of misconduct. The conversation in the church hallways and over coffee was furtive and low. Wendy was overheard saying, "I hate to put him down, but I just don't believe it. Pastor Wilson would never do anything like that. Many of us know that Jonathan has had a history of emotional struggles. Don't you think emotional instability has something to do with these crazy allegations?" Thirdly, if we want to change the culture around sexual abuse in the church, we must dismiss the notion that sexual misconduct allegations are the product of emotionally disturbed people. If an individual has a history of mental health problems, that does not mean their experience of abuse is not real. In fact, maybe Jonathan's problems and emotional instability is the result of his abuse. As Carol said last evening, people with emotional vulnerabilities are in fact ideal targets of the perpetrator. So much so that in my experience, I'm willing to suggest that an individual's history of emotional vulnerability or promiscuity may in fact be indicators that actually validate the complainant's story of abuse more than discrediting it. Let's be extremely careful what we rush to discount. On the side of caution, though, we must, however, always remain open that an allegation may not be substantiated. The life, vocation, reputation, career of a pastor, a ministerial person, professional is at stake. There is a lot here for the person who's been accused. And I have overseen an investigation at one point where, in fact, the allegation was proven after a careful investigation by denominational protocols, by a panel of 3 professionals who evaluated the allegation and said, no, this allegation is without merit. And then their conclusions were shared with our credentialing body. The best protection for both complainant and the accused is a well-crafted policy and procedure for investigation. "Oh, come on," said Jane in an exasperated tone. "It's been over 25 years since this allegation against Pastor George is supposed to have taken place. Well, I just saw him in the grocery store the other day, and he and his wife are finally able to begin enjoying retirement. He was such a good pastor." Why would anyone drag something like this up from 25 years ago? As if they could even remember what happened, even if it's true. It's ancient history. Jessie is an 87-year-old woman nearing the final years of her life. As she sits with her counselor sharing the deep, painful story of abuse from so many years ago, she feels the sharpness of the shame and pain as if it were yesterday. Why did I wait these 30 years to talk to a trusted professional like you? I guess it was that announcement in church that Pastor Mitchell had been found guilty of professional misconduct. They say it happened 15 years ago in Ebenezer Church. That's the church he went to after he left our church. I guess I wasn't the only one. I think that's what gave me the courage to come talk to you. You know, it'll be a real relief to process this and make peace with myself and God while I still can. 4, Changing the culture around sexual abuse in the church means we must recognize that emotional pain does not have an expiry date. If I've learned anything about sexual abuse and professional misconduct, it is that victim pain does not have an expiry date. 1 year, 10 years, 30 years, it doesn't make a difference. Unless the pain is disclosed and dealt with and healing steps pursued, it festers like a gangrenous wound. It might lie dormant or repressed for years. And sometimes it's not until after the abuser has died does the victim finally have the courage to step forward and share their experience. Finally, it feels safe. And it's not uncommon for the 18-year-old who thought they were having an affair with their prof years later to realize, no, this was grooming. I was a victim. That wasn't consensual. Roger, who was overseeing a clergy discipline investigation, picked up the call in his office. It was the local press on the phone. The reporter demanded to know all about this allegation of misconduct against a prominent clergy person in the community. Who's the woman making the allegation? If someone's going to make an allegation like this, the least they can do is have the decency and honesty to stand up and be counted. The church hasn't given us a name, and the public has a right to know who the accuser is. Besides, how serious was it? Did he rape her? Was it an affair? Did he just touch her? Or was it intercourse? Just sexual harassment? We need to know. Fifthly, if we want to change the culture around sexual abuse in the church, we have to ensure that the confidentiality of the victim is respected. Remember, the church is not a court of law. If the abuse had been criminal in nature, it would be before a court of law, most likely. We know how victims have been treated. You saw the stats last night. We in the church, on the other hand, have the option to do it differently and in ways that are more supportive and compassionate both for victim and perpetrator. So my advice to Roger would be to offer no specifics. Whether it is the person next to you in the pew, the curious folk in the congregation down the road, the inquiring minds of the press or the wider public, none of them are owed or deserve the confidential details of another's life or pain. I, for one, want the church to be a place of safety, not a viewing gallery for the inquisitive who want to make their own evaluations of the evidence. What makes us think anyone would come forward with a disclosure of abuse if their name is going to be bandied about in public or the explicit details of their sexual abuse put on display for public gossip? If victims of abuse are going to have the courage to name their pain and speak their truth, the church must respond in supportive, compassionate ways. Victims are never going to come forward if they're afraid they'll become the victim of a public voyeurism and have their pain and shame put on display for everyone to gawk at. And friends, this is serious. I know of cases where victims have not come forward for these very reasons. They don't want their life to be put on display. They are afraid. And if victims don't come forward, the perpetrator has just been given free rein. Without a complaint, a perpetrator will never be held to account. A perpetrator not held to account may be a perpetrator who continues to offend. How is this in the best interests of the church, of any of us? On the other hand, those of us dealing with disclosure and allegations can be fully transparent about the existence of a complaint, about the process that is being used to evaluate the complaint, the names of those who are involved with the investigation. On the process side, we can give all kinds of detail. On the personal side, we err on the side of confidentiality. In summary, if we want to change the culture around sexual abuse in the church and truly become a victim and survivor-affirming church, we need to make the following changes in our attitudes and practices. 1, victims need to know they'll be treated with respect. We need to resist the knee-jerk reaction of blaming the victim. 3, we must dismiss the notion that allegations are the product of emotionally disturbed people. 4, we need to recognize that emotional pain does not have an expiry date. And 5, we must ensure that victim confidentiality is protected. Sadly, this is not always the culture we have embodied in the church. And at times we have often silenced the victim and minimized their stories. Rather, being willing to believe the perpetrator and protect them, refusing to believe that our dear camp director, our beloved professor, or wonderful pastor could ever stoop this low. Those are some of the key things we need to think about shifting culture. But let me also share with you some of the broader learnings that I have discovered in terms of dealing with some of this agenda. So, lessons I've learned along the way. After the lawyer left the board meeting, the board members around the table had a pretty clear idea of what they were dealing with. Liability insurance would not cover any actions they took related to this case. To put it simply, insurance coverage was non-existent. If they were sued by the victim, there'd be no coverage. If they were sued by the perpetrator, there would be no coverage. Liability-wise, they and the denomination were on their own. Before she left, the lawyer reminded the board members that it was her responsibility to advise on a course of action that would expose the organization to the least risk. That is my legal duty. And just to be clear, she said, I want to go on record as advising you that doing nothing exposes you to the least risk. Legally, you don't owe the victim anything. He might be angry if you do nothing, but this is your best option for minimizing risk. That's my legal advice to you. She continued, what you choose to do, however, is up to you. I'm giving you legal advice, not moral advice. As a church, you might decide to respond differently, but that's for you to decide. The board members around the table looked at each other, knowing that they faced a stark decision. Alice spoke first. I understand what our lawyer is saying, but I believe we're called to do what is right. Peter jumped in. I agree. Responding compassionately and morally may not be in the denomination's best legal interest, but whenever I face tough choices, the only way I sleep at night is knowing I did the right thing. Now it's Cindy's turn. That's how I feel. I don't think our actions in this case can be driven by money or minimizing risk. Jesus wasn't very risk adverse. He got crucified. If need be, I think I'm ready to go there. Susan, the executive staff person, believed it was important to play the devil's advocate to ensure that the board fully understood the decision it was prepared to make. She put it bluntly. If we go this route, we may be opening ourselves up not only to risk, but also to a can of worms. We don't know where this might lead, what this might uncover, and what the course of action might unleash. Are we ready for that? Peter responded immediately. If there's a can of worms, there's a can of worms. We'll deal with it. We need to do the right thing. The nods around the board table spoke volumes. Susan smiled. She had never been prouder of a board decision. Lesson 1. Whose advice do we take? Now, the lesson that I have learned in these situations over and over again is be sure you get legal advice. On matters like this, you are always in way over your head. Legal guidance is critically important and always relevant. It lets you make wise and informed decisions. I would never be without it. In the final analysis, though, whose advice do we take? As the lawyer herself said, legal advice is not always moral advice. As a church, we stand for compassion, justice, courage, and doing the right thing. We're not in the business of sacrificing victims on the altar of expediency or risk avoidance. The nephew of Pastor Williams sat across the table from the executive minister in the church office. How can you do this to me? How can you do this to our family? Some slutty woman seduces my uncle, and you turn around and strip him of his ministerial credential and parade him before the public like some criminal? I thought the church was about compassion and forgiveness. Maybe he made a mistake, but it wasn't his fault. You've ruined his life. You've ruined all our lives. I'm done with this hellhole you call church. With that, he slammed the door behind him and left the church, maybe for good. Lesson 2. Whose pain do we give preference? This is one of the more difficult and painful lessons that I've learned along the way. The reality is that whenever we deal with ministerial sexual misconduct and take action that supports the victim and holds the perpetrator accountable, the circle of pain will widen. Not maybe, by definition. Disclosure will create more victims. What do I mean by that? When the church discloses the actions and impact of the perpetrator's family and social network get to participate in the shame and pain of that experience. Sheltering the perpetrator's social network from participating in that pain is, I believe, unethical if it further victimizes the primary victim or means that disclosure of misconduct is actually withheld from the public. We may start with one victim, but we end up with many more persons who will feel victimized. Just start thinking about that list. And then there's the congregation itself. As Carol said last night, congregations can take decades to heal from a serious experience of professional misconduct. So whose pain do we give preference? The victim, like the perpetrator, also has family, spouse, friends, peers, colleagues. Is their pain not equally important? How do you balance pain in the church on the scales of justice? My default is to give preference to the victim. If disclosing abuse widens the circle of pain, that is where I, as a church leader, need to remember that it was the perpetrator who is responsible for creating victims of their family and social network, not the church. The church's actions did not create this burden of pain. Church leaders dealing with the difficult fallout of misconduct are not responsible for the ripple effects of the perpetrator's actions. Here's where I think we as church leaders are invited to exercise faith. We need to trust that dealing directly and publicly with professional sexual misconduct is the approach that will create better outcomes in the long run for all concerned. If we as church leaders are not willing to enter the fray and make hard decisions, then we are likely abandoning the victim and sacrificing them on the altar of least resistance. When I find myself in this position, I need to remind myself that I did not choose to create this mess. It was the perpetrator who chose to inflict pain on their relational network, not me nor the church. As a church, we don't get to own the perpetrator's actions. We just get to live with them. Barbara was in church Sunday morning. At the end of the service, two people from the denominational office were introduced. The church council chairperson said they had an important announcement to make. One of the denominational staff persons stood up and made a statement. They said that Jared Stewart, the congregation's former pastor, had been charged with sexual misconduct and was on leave while an investigation was underway. The denominational office wanted his former congregation to know that this was the case, and the statement concluded with an offer to listen to any concerns that members might have or any questions related to the investigation process. The conversation that followed over coffee hour in the fellowship hall was definitely animated. "I can't believe it," said Joe. "They said that allegation was from 12 years ago. How can you investigate something that old?" Joan piped up, "And he's been on an overseas assignment for 8 of those years. If that doesn't demonstrate his commitment to Christ, what does?" Jack jumped right in. "Best pastor we ever had. He made everyone feel like they belonged. And the hours he spent mentoring our young adults." "You know," drawled Sam, "these denominational folks are no lawyers. What makes them think they can investigate something like this?" The last comment came from Shirley, just as the chime sounded for the study hour. "Pretty sketchy, I'd say." Barbara had been silent throughout the conversation. No one seemed to have noticed. She didn't feel like going to the study hour, so she slipped out the side door and went home. "What a bunch of jerks," she thought to herself. "What do they know? They seem to think they're always right about everything." It was a long night. But in the morning, Barbara picked up the phone and called her friend Robert. "Robert, can you go with me to the denominational office tomorrow?" "I want to lodge a complaint with them about Pastor Stewart." Lesson 3. How much do we say? It can be very tempting to say very little about public communication of misconduct. It is important to communicate findings of misconduct. Critically important because, one, it will validate the complainant's experience in public. 2, it is also critical because it invites other people to come forward, like Jessie, the 87-year-old woman. 3, victims need to know that the communication is about process and that their confidentiality is held paramount. You need to expand the circle of communication to the extent of what that person's work experience. If they worked internationally, that communication should go international. Regional. Wherever they were, that circle needs to be informed. And finally, perhaps one of the most important reasons to communicate about misconduct is to put both clergy and laity on notice that the church does not tolerate sexual misconduct. James was adamant that he didn't want any public announcements about the investigation of how Pastor Jordina's behavior constituted sexual abuse. I know what she did was wrong, but at this point, I'm getting the help that I need. I don't want to see her entire life ruined because of this. I still care about her as a human being. "To hell with the lawyers and the prissy old ladies," roared Samantha. "I want the church to publish the full investigation report about abuse, including every last detail of what that pervert did to me. I want the world to know what a twisted person he is. Let him feel what it's like to be humiliated in front of his family and friends. He gets no sympathy from me." Lesson 4. Manage the conflict between the victim and the organization. I will be surprised if you never run into a point where you will not have competing interests between the church and the victim, and there will be a conflict. James wants too little communication. Samantha wants too much. How do you manage those competing interests? The church has a whole range, a congregation, pastors, an entire system, perpetrator's family, all kinds of considerations that they get to manage. The victim only manages their own stuff, and that's appropriate. But sometimes what a victim wants and what's in the best interest of the church may not be the same thing. And we need to be willing to manage that conflict. Finally, lesson 5. I've been living with this hell for 15 years, said Jillian. This abuse stuff just never goes away. It's emotionally devastating. Some days are good, some days are bad. It's impacted my relationship to my spouse and kids, affected my career. But I'm finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. This is the hardest thing I've ever faced as a board member, said Rachel. Our decision to go public on this misconduct file has cost my daughter one of her best friends. Their family just won't talk to us anymore. They think we caved to a crazy allegation that hurt Pastor Dan's family. This misconduct impacts so many people, said Nathan. It's not just the victims that I feel badly about. You know, just last week I saw Pastor Dan at the mall mopping floors. Going from the largest church in our denomination to sweeping floors at the mall? What a way to ruin your life. At the denominational office, Linda, the financial manager, sat staring at the check in her hand. That's nice, she thought. $1,000 donation to our counseling support fund for victims of clergy abuse. That'll help a bit. Now, if I can just figure out where we're going to get that money for the $12,000 legal bill. Oh, I almost forgot about that $8,000 bill for the investigation. Expect we're looking at a deficit this year. Our denominational leaders are way offside on this sexual abuse stuff, declared Amber to her friends during coffee hour. I don't think they understand what they're doing. I'm going to suggest at our annual meeting that we reduce our congregational budget line for the wider church. They certainly aren't getting a year-end gift from me this year. Mandy wiped a tear from her eyes as the last box was moved into the 2-bedroom apartment. It was barely 2 months now since the divorce papers were signed. As she looked around, she thought to herself, it's a lot smaller than the 4-bedroom parsonage in Jamesville. I'll miss that big lot, especially the trees and gardens. The kids will just have to get used to it. Damn it, Jim. Why did you do it? Lesson 5. Sexual abuse is costly. I don't need to say a lot more. Professional misconduct comes with a horrendous price tag. Friends, this must change. The lives and health of too many people, the health of the church is at stake. But there is, I believe, a silver lining behind the dark cloud. The horrendous damage that inflicted by sexual abuse that might push us into hopelessness and despair is tempered by our Christian belief in the great mercy of a God who has the power to open up healing paths even in the midst of darkness. By God's great mercy, God has given new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purposes. Resurrection is perhaps the most powerful of all Christian symbols. Christians embrace the conviction that no matter how horrendous the evil or how grievous the sin, the death and darkness do not have the last word. We cannot allow sexual abuse to have the last word. Behind the dark clouds of sexual abuse, God is at work to bring life out of death, healing out of incredible pain, restoration out of brokenness. confident in the power of resurrection that courses through our lives and our world, we can allow this life-giving Spirit of the divine to be at work among us. This renewing, healing Spirit has the power to bind up our wounds, restore what is broken, and direct us along healing paths so that our lives might be whole again, and that we can once more drink deeply from the cup of life.